Hey guys, welcome back to the channel, and in today's video I want to talk a bit more about the particular study techniques and revision methods that I've used pretty much throughout my entire school and university career that's enabled me to get all A stars at GCSE, A-level and get a first from LSE studying BSc Economics. Now, a couple of disclaimers. This is probably one of my more requested videos. I've had a couple of comments on YouTube from the same individual, Cryptic God, who's requested this. I've had a couple of people offline who've also wanted to see this, and just note that these techniques that I'm about to talk about, they're very personal to me and they may not necessarily work for you. For example, I've got quite a strong memory and I'm quite a visual learner, so these techniques are all kind of catered towards my strengths. So by all means try these methods out, see if they work for you, but if they don't, there are plenty of other YouTube videos online from other creators who you might find useful instead. The other thing is that whilst these techniques are broadly the same for school and university, there are some slight differences simply due to the kind of nature of the content and style of the content being taught, and so you have to make slight tweaks, and to the best of my ability I'll talk about those in the video wherever appropriate. But okay, so without further ado, let's get straight into the video. So the first thing I'd suggest you do is to get ahead early now. Start refamiliarizing yourself with the content and concepts that you were taught last year, but you might have found slightly difficult, that may have taken slightly more time for you to get your head around. Simply because it's likely that, especially when you're at school and even at university, the things that you'll be taught this year will build upon the things that you were taught last year. And so it makes sense for you to just have a quick look at some of these concepts before school actually starts, so that you don't have to struggle when these teachers are teaching you new concepts because you don't have the proper foundation. You'll have developed those in those few weeks prior to school starting. In addition to kind of refamiliarizing yourself with prior concepts, I'd also suggest reading ahead. Maybe if you're at school, I'd suggest 2 to 3 weeks ahead. At university, it's slightly more difficult to read ahead, given that a lot of the time you kind of will require the lecturers to provide more information than the slides do. But still, maybe aim to be a week ahead, like at least have read the lecture slides before going to the lecture. At LSE, at least, you were able to enroll into your modules from July or August onwards, so you still could enroll quite early on. And from there, I'd suggest maybe looking at the first few slides, like the first few weeks of lecture slides. And sometimes they also have the previous year's lecture recordings available. So just go through those and just familiarize yourself with the kind of content that you'll be covering that year. The second thing I want to talk about is how I actually study. I study in quite a weird way. I did quite subconsciously, but having reflected on it, I think this is kind of how I do it. As probably most students do, like you want to actually read through the material that you're being taught. And I actually go through the material several times, but the way in which I read the material varies each time that I read it. So the first time that I go through the content, I want to just do a very quick skim read of the content. This first stage is just making sure that you understand the concepts at a somewhat high level, or just keeping a mental note that this particular chapter or this particular section may be quite difficult, and just preparing yourself in advance for that. It's not about memorizing, it's not about really deeply understanding, it's just to gain that first exposure. So what that would mean for me practically at university, for example, would just be go through the lecture slides quite quickly and go, okay, this kind of makes sense, this all seems fairly intuitive. Or it might be going through the lecture at 2 times speed and just listening to it and trying to listen out for anything that just sounds weird or like doesn't immediately register in my head. The second time you go through, you want to be going through the content in a lot more detail. This is the point where you want to start highlighting the content, the lecture slides, for example, making any supplementary notes to clarify any details that may not initially be clear. I know some people make mind maps and things. I wouldn't do that. I would personally really like to create bullet point lists, especially ones which had a certain structure. For example, let's say I'm studying the process of eutrophication. I would just create like a very small bullet point list with with kind of each step of the process simplified down into a few words and like an arrow kind of showing that this links into this, that links into this, that links into this. And that's kind of how I would personally do it. Again, this process isn't actually about memorizing per se. It's more so about creating the systems and the building blocks that will make memorization easier for you going further down the line. Because you're going through these concepts in a lot of detail, you're really exposing yourself to the content, making sure that you understand each and every line of the content, so that there are no like kind of holes in your understanding. And kind of on that note, really go into depth with this kind of second read. Don't take anything as given. Like, try and understand why these concepts work, like what the process is. Make sure that it all kind of makes sense to you. And if you do have any questions, like, question yourself and like research it a bit more on YouTube or Google or whatever, just to make sure that you have a really comprehensive understanding of the content. And so by kind of asking a bunch of questions about the thing and not just accepting it at first premise, you really develop a strong understanding of the concept and not just a surface level understanding. In order to be able to like critically think and evaluate the subject, implicitly you're developing a really good understanding, and that will, rather than staying in your short-term memory, will go and stay in your long-term memory. By the way, all this stuff about the short-term and long-term memory, this is complete bro science. Like, I am not a doctor, I studied economics, but just from my own kind of anecdotal evidence, this could be entirely placebo. This is how I find it, and it seems to work for me. If you followed steps 1 and 2, you're hopefully 2 to 3 weeks ahead of the school schedule, and you have a really good understanding of the subject content. But the beauty of this system is that now, when the school actually goes through that content in 2 to 3 weeks time, that's just as that information is probably about to leave your long-term memory. Rather than this being the first exposure to the content, this is the second time that you're being exposed. And so effectively, the school lesson is no longer you being the first time that you're learning the content, but instead it acts as a revision lesson, and it further just reinforces everything that you already kind of know into further detail. You're able to go into this lesson and really just use it to clarify the key things that you didn't understand initially, or to just refamiliarize yourself with a concept that you've already covered before. And I think one real great advantage of this is that you never go into a lesson and within 5 minutes not know what on earth is going on. Like, I think especially at university, it's really easy to go into a lecture having not kind of looked at the lecture slides before, and then within 5 minutes they've introduced a concept that doesn't make sense to you, and then you can't follow the rest of the lesson or the lecture. And so by being 2 to 3 weeks ahead and having a good grasp of the subject content, you will never be in that situation. Another benefit is just the leeway or the cushion that this kind of system provides you with. If something comes up where you cannot study any school material for that entire week, for example, if you're preparing for the UCAT or the TSA or an interview, it doesn't matter, because as long as you're sufficiently ahead, if you're 2 to 3 weeks ahead, if you lose 1 week, you're still a week ahead. Whereas if you're just on track with what school's teaching you and you have to take time away from your school studies, by the time you return, you might be a week back. And covering that ground, covering the past content, while also having to catch up with what the school is teaching you kind of simultaneously, is really, really difficult. So again, kind of developing or creating a cushion for yourself very early on in the school year is really, really beneficial. Right, a really obvious bit of advice that I think a lot of people don't actually follow is to study for your end of chapter tests, and to also actually do the homework that your teacher is setting you. And yes, guys, I know it's a lot of effort, but doing your homework is really, really beneficial for a number of reasons. Firstly, homework once again reinforces the concepts that you've previously covered. It makes sure that you don't just have a surface level understanding, but rather like a good enough understanding for you to actually apply the concepts and theories that you've been taught to a more practical problem. And so I found, especially at university, that there were plenty of times where I thought I understood something having gone through the lecture slides, but then when doing the homework, realized that I just didn't understand it in enough detail. And so doing homework will really give you that kind of reality check. The other benefits of homework are that, one, they're a really great revision tool going forward, and two, just the feedback that you get from your teachers is really, really beneficial. I personally like looking at my previous submissions when revising for my final year exams, because it enables me to kind of look at my thought process back then, and also I can see if there are any points that I can't think of now that I may have been able to think of when I was first covering the content. The second thing about being assessed by your teachers is that you're going to get feedback about the quality of your submission and the things that you could have improved upon. And I found this incredibly useful, particularly for essay subjects like history, English literature, English language, that were never particularly my strong suits. And so by getting regular feedback, I could iteratively improve over the year and focus on the things that the teacher had suggested to me. That being said, you do at the same time want to be efficient with your time, and this is particularly true when you're at university. If you're still not able to make a dent after 20 minutes, it's unlikely that in the 30th minute you're gonna have a eureka moment. Like, each marginal minute is unlikely to produce anything. And so I'd say after maybe 20-25 minutes, move on to the next question if you haven't already. Moving on to the actual studying for chapter tests element. Remember, initially in steps 1 and 2, I never said that you had to memorize the content when you're doing that skim read and the understanding parts. That's because the real memorization part of your learning will come when you're doing the chapter tests. That's because these chapter tests effectively break down the entire exam syllabus into small chunks for you to cover across the entirety of the year, rather than forcing you to have to cram down all this content right at the very end. And at least at LSE, we would have kind of exams in January and in the summer. So I would suggest revising or starting to revise a few weeks before the end of term in each case. Do not leave your revision until the actual holidays, these like kind of revision holidays. Start a little bit earlier and it will become so much more manageable for you. So I'd suggest maybe 3 weeks before the end of term, just start very quickly going through the weeks 1, 2, 3 content, like as much as you can. Ideally, or hopefully, the initial weeks, they shouldn't be too difficult because they're more likely to focus on the more basic concepts, so you should be able to get through them fairly quickly. But by giving yourself that head start, it just means that you have more time to prepare for the exams. Okay, in terms of how to actually revise, I'm going to break this down into how to actually memorize the content and then kind of doing the exam questions or question prep. In terms of memorizing content, again, I would read through the material, but each time I'd read through the material or the notes, I'd do so in a slightly different way. So again, the first time that I would read through the material, I would just skim read it and make sure that I still understood everything, that there was nothing that jumped out at me as, oh, I do not recall studying this. If you do go through that and have one of those moments, just again make a mental note for myself that, okay, I might need to spend a bit more time on this. The second time that I'd go through the content, I would go through it literally page by page. And if the content isn't already like this, I would transform the content so that you basically have it as a bunch of subheadings of a bullet point list underneath each subheading. And the reason why I suggest you to do this is because by turning it into this format, it's very structured and regimented, and so you can quite easily recall, right, this is the subheading, these are the bullet points underneath it, and it just breaks it up rather than having to kind of try and remember like a whole mass of text. I would suggest like writing down, like keeping a note of how many bullet points there are under each subheading. This is really beneficial because when you get an exam question, for example, hopefully when you see the question, you can identify which part of the specification or the syllabus this question is referring to. And then from there, you can remember, right, it's this question is referring to this topic, and in this topic, I know that there are 8 bullet points. And so therefore, whatever my answer is, it's got to make up it's got to be made up of some mixture of these 8 points. You're going to try and memorize the list, and you're going to try and memorize the list in the exact order that it's written down. And the reason why I emphasize exact order is because a lot of the time it makes intuitive sense to learn it that way. For example, if you're revising for history, let's say, you're going to lose marks if you don't remember it in chronological order. Even if it's a subject like economics, where there's not necessarily a chronological order to things, for example, the factors of demand, you could theoretically say it in any order you wanted. I'd still suggest learning it in the exact same order every single time. And that's because it creates a set of consistency between revision sessions. If you learn it the exact same way every single time, it kind of creates a sense of muscle memory. Like, it flows off the tongue easier. So for example, if there are 8 bullet points, if you learn the list in a different order every single time, it might be hard to recall all 8 quite easily. But if you learn the 8 in the same exact order every single time, even if you kind of start getting stuck on the 4th, like, your muscle memory will kind of enable you to like better recall the 5th and 6th bullet point, simply because you've gone through that list and said that list over and over and over again. It kind of becomes, a force of habit for you to say it in that exact order. So read the bullet point list again and again, multiple times. Just try keep a track of how many bullet points there were per list. Just get an intuition for like what each of the bullet points meant, what they were actually referring to. Keeping a track of kind of the flow of the bullet points, like which bullet point followed the next, so like what was bullet point 4, what was bullet point 5, and just getting a feel for the order. And then also, if the bullet points were quite lengthy, which is often the case when you're trying to learn like the chronological order of something, just remembering 2 or 3 trigger words that would help you, that when you could use to like kind of recall the entire sentence. But to further solidify my memory of the material, I would write down the bullet point list on a separate piece of paper without looking obviously at the initial list and seeing what I could actually remember. And I would like literally write down 1, 2, 3, like all the way through to 8, and write down like which ones I could remember, and I would just put question marks on the ones that I forgot. And again, I would go back for the ones where I forgot. I would go back to the list, really focus on those. I would pay attention to what was the bullet point that was before and what was the bullet point after it. So I would be able to use the actual order of the list as a memory tool. So I would do this again and again and try improve each time. And so iteratively, I would get better and memorize more and more of the list and make fewer and fewer mistakes. And eventually, like, I would go off from paper. So I'd start from maybe saying the first time round, I might write the entire sentence for each bullet point. Then the second time round, I might just write the 2 to 3 trigger words. And eventually I might just move entirely to thinking about the list in my head and being able to like just count them on my fingers, and that would work. By forcing ourselves to learn the list in such detail with such a regimented structure and order to it, it becomes a lot easier to recall during actual exam conditions where it's a lot easier to get mind blanks. We're trying to kind of eliminate that possibility by using tricks like the order of the list to try back solve effectively some of the bullet points which we wouldn't otherwise be able to get. Now, in terms of doing questions, I don't like actually doing the questions immediately after I've revised the subject content. Again, simply because I think that if I were to do that, I'd rely more so on my short-term memory, just kind of regurgitating things that I literally read maybe 5 minutes ago. So instead, I like to actually go through a couple of chapters or sections worth of content before I return to the initial set of questions. So for example, I might do chapters 1, 2, and 3 using the method that I just mentioned. And after I've gone through chapter 3, I'd then move back to the chapter 1 questions and then go through those, the chapter 2 questions, chapter 3 questions, and do it like that. And then move on to chapters 4, 5, 6, for example. And this way, because I'm being more reliant on my long-term memory, it means that I'm forcing myself to make sure that I understand the content rather than just rely on my short-term memory. I found that kind of a sweet spot for me was probably about 3 weeks worth of content before returning to the first week. But I don't know, it might vary from person to person. But I think broadly you should just get a sense that you think that the initial content may start to be slipping from your memory, and that's when you want to go and revisit the question. Now, After having done all the kind of chapter questions, I would then move on to the mock exams and the past papers, because these are ultimately your best practice for the actual exam, because the question style is the most similar. Okay, so that's basically the bulk of the video done. Just some final tips. I would suggest, one, using the internet to aid you in your study. As I mentioned, sometimes the textbooks or the revision guides might not be all that good in explaining a concept, in which case definitely use something like Google or YouTube to try boost your understanding. Similarly, on the internet you can also find lots of good like actual study resources, study notes, study PDFs. If you're a university student, there's a website called studoku.com, I want to say. I'll put the link in the description below. And effectively what that is a website where former students have basically uploaded all their notes. And I found that really useful. In fact, I did basically the entirety of one of my third year modules using some of the reading summaries that someone had uploaded onto the website. The other benefit of Studoku, which is quite not controversial, but do not abuse this, is sometimes they have solutions to the kind of problem set questions. And so I would sometimes use those, like if I was stuck after 20 minutes, like I mentioned earlier, to try and get myself a bit of a hint. Finally, I'd suggest reaching out and working with others who are studying the same things as you. It just makes the entire learning process a lot more enjoyable. You can share resources, share notes, you can test each other. And I've actually found that testing each other and teaching each other different concepts is a really good way of studying, because in order for you to be able to teach someone else, you have to have a pretty good understanding of the concept yourself. But okay guys, that's me done for today. If there's any other kind of video content that you'd like to see, please let me know in the comments down below. If you liked today's video, please like, subscribe and share the video. That's it for today. Thanks a lot guys.